Greetings, Kerbonauts. This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is episode number 25 of Project Odyssey, in which we need to launch this massive rocket to Duna. That fairing is filled with satellites. We have an entire network that's on its way there. They're going to deposit themselves into various orbits around Duna and around Ike. It's going to provide all of the local communications that I will ever need in order to do anything I want over in that system. I've added a couple more mods since last time, and one of them I'm going to show you in the bottom right. Imagine some triangles and you snip the corners off of them to make hexagons. Well, there are these new truss pieces that I'm using. In this launch right here, there's a structure that goes right up through the center of this, and all of my satellites that are going to deposit themselves around Duna are docked to the sides of this thing. But you will see that soon. Right now, we are still making our way into orbit. Stage 1 is now behind us. The engine ring of Stage 2 is also dropping behind us, and we are now powering our way into orbit on the engines of Stage 2. And while I look at them, I'm noticing these gigantic gaps in between the flames again, and I've seen that a few times now. And I'm beginning to think I may be seeing a pattern. I have noticed that sometimes when things are running slower than max rate, and in the upper left you can tell what the physics rate is by if it's yellow, the text is yellow, that means it's going slower, a little bit slower. Red means it's going much slower than normal. And when you see that, maybe what's happening is the engines aren't able to render quick enough. And so what's happening is the gaps are forming, possibly because of that. Maybe it just has something to do with hot rockets. I'm not really quite sure which one it is. But there's so many parts in this rocket that might be what's causing it to slow down there. There's something like 400 parts when I'm in the VAB, and even after dropping some of the lower stages, most of the parts are up inside the fairing on all those satellites, and there's a bunch of docking nodes in there as well. And I know all of that together can add up to meaning that it renders things a lot slower and slows down the physics time. So maybe that has something to do with those big gaps in the engines. I'm just not completely sure. Well, there's our first look below that fairing and the payload. And there's yet another stage on this. The first one got us into orbit. We're only at 2 million, 3 million, something like that meters. We need a new stage to push us all the way to Duna. But before we do that, let's go back and take a look at some of the hilarity that ensued trying to get this one into orbit. We'll begin with the first rocket that didn't even want to leave the launch pad. You can see the boosters, they separated a little bit early there, I think, perhaps. Well, we gave it a little extra thrust just to see if it could have lifted off without them. It did okay there, but without those boosters, we were not going to be making it far enough. For launch number 2, can you say aerodynamic instability? Look at the debris field on this one, but if you think this is something, wait until you see number 3. Number 3 was pretty much like the first one. We hit a certain point, we hit some aerodynamic instability, but now look at this. Whoa! All that debris falling out behind us, a gigantic mass of particles. Are you ready for number 4? Because here it comes. Look, the boosters have separated and boosh! They've taken the engine with it. Oh no! And we had a whole bunch of fuel left in this stage too. We could have gone much higher than that. I decided to turn it into a staging test. So instead of just trying to go to space, we're going to decouple the lower stage, try out the engine, and well, I guess apparently we're going to be creating another debris field is what we're really doing here. I've made a change to how the boosters separate, hoping that this will improve, but no good. Another engine down the drain. Number 6 actually decoupled the boosters fine, but then failed in a totally uninteresting way. Number 7, we're back to losing our engine. By number 8, however, we have finally figured out what's wrong with the decoupling of the boosters, and it's no longer destroying the engine as they go by. Or maybe it is. What I decided was that it was the side boosters. There's little radial boosters on the side of the gigantic boosters, and they're intended to throw the gigantic boosters away off to the side, protecting the rocket itself from getting hit as they're decoupling. But I'm using Engine Controller version 2. I've mentioned this before, and it has a thrust chart in it. So what you're looking at here is me going in and re-editing what the chart looks like so that I can determine what thrust I want at different stages of the usage of those little boosters. On the far right of this chart is what the thrust value will be in a percentage from 0 up to 1 or 0% up to 100% when I first start it. And as the fuel is drained away, we will go left on the chart, and as we go toward the left and fuel is draining away, the thrust level will change. And as you can see, it will go up very high until it's almost 100%. And then the thrust is going to drop down as the amount of fuel remaining in the booster goes down until we get to the far left where the thrust value will come back toward almost 0. The bare minimum is 1%. And there we go, there's my new chart. So I do that, and then we go back out here again, and we have another launch, and this is the one that actually made it. So this one, they decoupled just fine. So now we return to the present, where we had decoupled everything and we were on our way to Duna. We're on the night side, so it's a little dark, but that nice ambient light thing there, that allows us to still see our launch. We have a trajectory that's taking us away from Kerbin in the same direction that Kerbin is traveling, which means we're going to go closer to Duna, since that's the side that Duna's on. But first I'm making one loop around the planet and coming back down again. I noticed that the electrical was going down as we were waiting to come around to our position again, so I decided to go out and put out the solar panels and fix the dishes before we go back and finish looping around back to our periapsis one last time, and the second time we are here, we can complete that Duna burn. But while we're still out here putting out all the solar that we're going to need and positioning ourselves against the sun, I realize this is a really great place in order to do our glamour shot style flyby and get a good look at that payload. So here you are, take it in. Isn't this thing gorgeous? You can see those new parts down in there. You can see all the satellites, 1, 2, 3 sets of 3 at the front and a couple at the back as well. But our time at our periapsis is done. We are now coming back around to the near side here where we're going to start the burn that finishes off this orbit. Just got to get pointed in the right direction and power up. This thing is pretty heavy. That's how come we had to go around Kerbin once and come back to the same spot. We burned part of our trip the first time through our periapsis, and now we're burning the second half of our trip the second time through the periapsis. All in all, this is costing us almost 1100 Delta V to make the transfer over to Duna. And how do I know that that's how much it's going to be? I could look at a Delta V chart, but I could also do some math, and sometimes math is fun. So the first thing we need to know is that Kerbin is where we currently are, and we need to know Kerbin's GM, that's the gravitational constant, and it just comes off of the wiki page. It's a number that never changes. We also need to know that we were orbiting at 80 kilometers. That allows us to calculate the escape velocity from that altitude, and that's simply another lookup out on a wiki page to get that formula. We double Kerbin's GM, we divide by the radius, how far away we are from the center of Kerbin, and we take the square root. That gives us 3,223 meters per second. Next, we want to know what kind of ellipse we'll be in when we're going between Kerbin and Duna. We'll be looking that up again on the Kerbal wiki page where we get the sun's GM, Kerbin's distance from the sun, and Duna's distance from the sun. Averaging those two distances, we get the semi-major axis, the transfer SMA right there. And using those, we're headed out to another wiki page. The Vis-Viva equation will tell us the velocity we need to be going if we know the GM of the thing we're orbiting, which is the sun, as well as the semi-major axis and our current location relative to the thing we're orbiting. Plugging all that in, we can see that an ellipse that goes from Kerbin to Duna should be traveling 10,203 meters per second at Kerbin. Kerbin itself, using the Visviva equation once again, we know is going 9,284 meters per second, which is a difference of 918 meters per second. Now it's time to figure out how much faster than escape velocity we need to go to reach Duna. If we were only going escape velocity, that means that as soon as we hit that speed, it would take us out to the SOI of Kerbin, and we'd be going just about 0 meters per second relative to Kerbin, almost. And that means we wouldn't actually go very fast beyond Kerbin's orbit. We need to go a little bit further. And to calculate that, it's one more wiki page if you don't already know the Pythagoras theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared, where in this case, the A and B are the escape velocity and our periapsis difference in speed. C in that ends up being the needed velocity, which you can see is 3351 meters per second. Now, we needed to know our velocity around Kerbin before this all started, which at 80 kilometers was 2279. We subtract how fast we need to be going from how fast we started, and we get 1072 meters per second. And that's how much delta V we needed to spend to make this entire transfer. Back at Kerbin, our second stage is now totally drained. It is essentially debris. So I'm going to go in and rename it using its flight computer little ringy thing there. And I'm going to mark it as debris so that it stops showing up on my map. So there we go, we're done, right? We can just sit back and watch the satellite pass by. There's nothing left to do. There's another launch to send up because we don't have any way of communicating with this satellite or with the Duna network yet. We have our deep space satellites going out, but we don't actually have a way to communicate with the deep space satellites once they get too far away from Kerbin. The maximum range on a TDRS satellite is 50 million meters, and by now the deep space satellites have gone that far away at least. So we're going to put up another deep space, but we're going to send it into a Molniya orbit. So if you've been watching the launch, you've seen that we've gone into a polar orbit. And as a reminder, look in the bottom right, there's the Molniya orbit. It's where you go really high in one direction, but stay really low, close to the planet on the other side. And that keeps you up way high in the air most of the time. We're passing over the South Pole now. We are already in the low orbit that we're going to want on this side. So we just set up our communications dishes here and then wait until we get over the very center of the South Pole so that we can continue our burn until we go up about, well, I guess we could get close to 50 million meters because that's how far away a TDRS would be able to communicate with this. We don't want to go past that. Otherwise, we'll even be losing communication with the new deep space one that's going into its Molniya orbit here. If we were designing a satellite specifically for this mission, it would probably be a little bit different from just reusing the same deep space satellite but sending it into the Molniya orbit. We would probably have a couple dishes that would point out to the existing deep space sats. We'd have a couple more that would be pointing at the local TDRS-E's. What we actually have is two dishes that point out to the deep space satellites as we need, but only one that's going to be pointing down here into a TDRS satellite. There's one more thing I want to do before we're totally done here. You notice I still have my frigate booster strapped on the bottom, and I want to deorbit it. First, we will set up our communications dishes from the TDRS satellites to point up to this, and then we can go all the way up here where we can finally decouple it and use the RCS to back off just a tiny little bit. It's not going to take much to deorbit from this altitude because we're going so slow already. In fact, just the act of decoupling, the strength, the force of the decoupler itself, because of the angle and because I was facing basically retrograde when I decoupled, it was enough to change my orbit by 30 kilometers. So we power up the satellite just by barely tapping on the gas, and we boosted it back up by another 30 kilometers, just like that. It's so trivial. Just like 0.1 meters per second is at this altitude enough to change me by a tremendous amount. So now we've switched out here to one of the deep space communication satellites. The problem with them is that they were pointing toward Kerbin, and now that I have my Molniya orbit satellite, I want to point them at it instead. However, I have to wait until mission control is able to link up temporarily to the satellites before I can then redirect them both one after the other to point at the new Molniya orbit satellite instead of letting mission control be the hub. So now the Duna network is in constant communication with Kerbin, which is going to allow me to do my mid-course correction here, bringing that orbit very, very close to Duna. It'll probably change just a tiny bit because of floating point errors, but we're going to get this as close to the planet as possible because that will make our entry to that system as efficient as we can get it. So here's the Duna network. From the bottom up, FASA launch clamps, KW boosters, KW engine, AIES decouplers, lights from the stock station parts, add-on, B9 for the struts, more FASA launch towers, SXT for the fuel, KW for the fairings and the engine, as well as the ullage motors. FASA for the avionics ring, KW for the fairing. In here we have the Aerojet decoupler covering up my Centaur stage. It's using the FASA engine. Near future for the cooling units. AIES for the dish. Aerojet RCS engines. We'll slide ourselves in here a little closer. More surface lights, slightly changed in color to give a little red up here and a little blue down there. A little structure in there to have something to put the engine on. We have Cosmos pack in order to get these radial monopropellant tanks. Aerojet fuel tanks, structure, and another fuel tank. And then the upper version, FASA avionics right there, to give control to the entire satellite itself. And technically, this is multiple satellites all stacked on top of each other. We have 3 for communication at the top. We have 3 in the middle for scanning, 3 more for communication, and then 2 more down here that are going to serve as long-range communication. And that's why they have the gigantic dishes. They'll also act as short-range links, which is why I have these dishes on in here. Now these I'm going to show in more detail once we actually get to Duna, so it'll make more sense if I've shown them to you right before we're about to use them, rather than show them to you now, and then next week get to actually using them around Duna and have you forget what I showed you this week. So we'll look at them then.
You are all the best technicians Kerbin has left to offer. Tell me you're ready for this test.
We think so, sir.
You better be. Our sun goes supernova in 6 days. If we can't open these portals, we're all doomed.
Well, the planet's doomed no matter what.
Yes, but Kamalak's new dimension seems way more stable than ours, and their Kerbin is almost the same as ours. We'll bring as much of our culture through as we can and start over there. If there's anything we Kerbals know how to do, it's start over and not only survive, but thrive. Are you ready to open it and begin this wormhole linking?
Yes, sir. But we warn you again, this is dangerous. We'll be making a bridge between here and 2 other stations that will encompass the planet, so if anything goes wrong, we may not have any chance to react.
In 6 days, it won't matter anyway. Open the wormholes.
This is Alpha Station, activating now. This is Beta Station, activating now.
This is Eagle Base, completing the loop, activating now.
Meanwhile, back in our dimension, we're ready to launch the Hydra III. The Hydra III is a whole new design, but based on the previous version, so it's still a Hydra. We have a new Centaur 2, and the initial stage, if you were paying close attention, you saw was a solid rocket booster. That booster was specifically designed to lift our Hydra III into low Kerbin orbit, anywhere up to, say, about 300 kilometers. After the Centaur 2 decouples, it's able to deorbit itself automatically, and then we can switch back to the Hydra III and watch as it continues its journey toward the space station. But while it's fun to watch those cinematic launches, I enjoy sometimes dissecting the mechanics of how all of this works. And this is what it looked like when I was launching it. In the bottom right, I was actually, the first time through, this is a second launch to give you a demonstration. The first time through, I had right-clicked on my booster so that I could watch as the fuel drained and look at the thrust value and the ISP value to see how it was changing. And above that, I had another window so that I could watch the Q value and know when I was passing through max Q and just what the Q value was all along the way. And of course, while I was doing all of that, I was also paying attention to where I was going, how fast I was going, where the apoapsis was at that moment, and what the relative inclination was to my target. I didn't have to worry about the throttle at all. In fact, look, the throttle is 0 because it's a solid rocket booster using that pattern just above the Q value window. That's the pattern that shows how it's going to burn. On the right was the highest point where I had the maximum thrust at the ground, and then it dropped off, went a little lower through max Q, and then at the very end, as we get closer here, you can see we're almost to the end. It's going to drop off dramatically because the weight is going way down, and the thrust to weight value is going to go way up unless the thrust is reduced in order to account for all of that lost mass. It still rises pretty high though. I had accounted for carrying a little bit extra mass in case I had cargo. This launch is not carrying that cargo, and therefore the thrust to weight ratio I think went up to about 3.1 or 3.2 before it started to taper off. If I'd been carrying cargo, it might have only gone to say 2.5 if it was a lot. And this brings us back to where we were now. We were in orbit on our way to the station, but there's a slight difference. Look at the Centaur down there. I'm going to give you a slightly better look here. The Centaur is a little bit different, and I'll talk about that in a moment in the VAB, but here's a good look at it. You can see that it's got a slightly different truss segment and a slightly different engine look to it. It's different because I updated the mod in between those two scenes. Here's the Hydra II. Check it out, sitting on a solid rocket booster. Nothing gets more Kerbal than putting your Kerbals on a solid rocket booster to lift off. And not only that, on the side of it, we have 2 more solid boosters right there. One's on the other side as well. Those fire when it decouples to send this thing on a retro to the upper stage here. Here's the decoupler right here. I can pull that away. There you go. There's the whole thing. That comes away. But first, let's go back down to the bottom and take a look. What do we see right there? Lights, more lights, more lights. There were lights all the way up the side of this thing. And for me, nothing gets more Kerbal than lights on a solid rocket booster. I even threw in a light ring right there. We'll pull off this decoupler and take a look underneath here. Now I have 2 versions of this. One version of this used a different, slightly different lower stage, a lower stage that you have seen in previous videos for the Centaur. And then I noticed yesterday that there was a new version. I don't know how long it had been out, but Aerojet had a new version with this totally different looking part right here. The problem is I didn't really like the new tanks with it. So I spent some time and I reworked it to make my tanks from 2.1 Aerojet work with the new truss segments and the new engine of 3.0 Aerojet. Anyway, let's take a good look up close in here. Look at that. That is really nice. It has this little bit that comes out on the side and it runs up and looks like it's going into the other tank. But if you take this off, you'll see that that's actually its engine fairing essentially. It only shows up once you've attached it and then it runs up in there. I'll do that one more time. See, it's gone and then you stick it on there and boom, it shows up, running that fuel line right up into the other tank. Very nice. That was one of the reasons why I like this new version. Let's take these monopropellant tanks off the side. Those are of course filled with hydrazine. So with this off there, we can see that of course it has more lights, but it also has on the side some hydrazine thrusters. These are lateral thrusters, right and left, one on each side, doubled up there. I also have some reverse thrusters. Those help boost it out of the fairing once it has decoupled. And we'll take this lower tank off, and then we can see we have our little structure piece here that attaches it on. Now, the old one used to look like this, just like that, but I decided I liked seeing the little bit more of the tank that I get to see with this one, and I just kind of like how unique those X's are relative to what it used to look like. We'll pull this one off there, and we can see that under there was another light ring and just a little shroud, which this one has the cool feature of being able to toggle editor visibility, so that's really nice. It lets me see inside to see that I had placed a couple batteries in there to give it enough power once it decouples to be able to deorbit. It's sitting on its avionics ring here, and then up under here we have our escape system, shroud, and the lower fairing. Sliding in a little bit closer here, we can see that we have, of course, communications and engines on the sides. I'm using the FASA engine as my propulsion for the Hydra. 4 solar panels, more RCS jets right there to give it the downward thrust. If I wanted to go in reverse, this little ring around the outside here is 4 different blocks of monopropellant hydrazine powered RCS engines. And these 4 here and around there, those go up. So if I want to reverse, I have that. If I want to go forward, I have these. Once it decouples, it looks like this. We have our heat shield down here protecting the interior. That is a cargo bay. We can open that up. You can see inside there we have 3 sections, 3 little canisters, boxes, Kerbal attachment system, whatever you want to call it. Thingamajigs that we can load up with fuel however we want. Lots of things are still not completely set up. It takes a really long time to create this install when you're doing every single part by hand. Lots of them still say fix my stats. Slowly but surely, as we use them, we try to fix them up though. Under here we have another light ring you can see up there, as well as some monopropellant tanks. And this thing hanging off right here, as well as there's 2 more over on here and here, those are landing legs. So when this finally lands, we're going to be able to set it down on the ground if we want to, because it'll be able to land softer on those legs. We'll pull that off and the ring off, and you can see that we have a ladder right there just in case. And up here, the SDHI docking node, a little ring that I made myself just to separate it so it wouldn't look dumb with the docking ring on top here being too big relative to the rest of the capsule. And then this is a ring of RCS hydrazine engines, and that just slides right on top there and gives me my attitude control to help balance it out, attitude control up at the top. And that is it. We are down to the capsule. Back out in orbit here, Jebediah is piloting and about to decouple, and oh, look at that thing go. The reason why that's shooting off as fast as it is, it's not the decoupler, it's not the strength of the decoupler or anything like that. It's that KSP believes that the engine is penetrating that adapter as if it were a solid surface and not hollow like it is, and for that reason it tries to separate the two parts. But there was no damage done, so we can flip over here to that spent stage, flip it around, and give it a little deorbit burn with the fuel that it has left. Next, we'll let Jebediah take control as he moves around, catching up on the space station. And once we get there, then it's just the usual slow down, trying not to collide with the thing. We were still a little bit on the dark side, so we're moving around to the light where we can get the sun for our docking attempt here anyway. Once Jeb and Hadfield are here on the station, they'll begin finishing the setup of it and making sure all the life support systems are in order. Wait a second. Hadfield? But I thought he was still missing. That sounds like a story for another day. Something to look forward to. Anyway, I was saying that they're going to make sure that the life support systems are set up and that all of the anomaly science systems are in order. We also have to dock eventually here, probably next episode, maybe the one after that, a whole gigantic living space and science center. But that will definitely be in another episode because this one is over. Until next time, I will see you later, Kerbinauts.
Hadfield, let me in. I left my keys inside. I locked myself out. Hadfield, open up. Hadfield?